Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's discussion on, as you can see here, one of your favorite topics, I suspect, domestic terrorism and ontology engineering. So let me, before we really even get into the outline of this, I just want to highlight some information. You might find this comical, you might find it scandalous. These are the causes of death in the U.S. Assessed in 2016. So you see heart disease is quite up there. Cancer is very high. Drug overdose, kidney disease, etc., suicide. Significant portions of the of deaths are associated with these. I'm not sure if this is surprising to you. Maybe it's not surprising. I know I wasn't too surprised when I saw this statistic. Uh, Google searches don't really Google searches for deaths in the US or about deaths or like death related searches don't track the actual causes. You see homicides higher than it would be over here. Cancer, though, I mean, anybody on WebMD is kind of drilled that way. Heart disease, very low. People don't really research that. Uh, Now, media coverage, though. See the difference. Media coverage tends to focus quite a bit more on things like homicide and terrorism. Suicide, actual, not too different from the searches in the public. But note the difference, the significant differences in what the actual causes are versus what people look up and what people or what the media portrays. And you can see this. This is just if you typed in causes of death in the U.S. There's a in our world in data. This is a pretty widely distributed graphic. What do you see? We have differences in understanding of causes of death in the U.S. and some things we think are quite pronounced when they're not. Terrorism holds a significant portion of media coverage, and it makes sense. It's scandalous, right? It's crazy. It's insane. Terrorists. Yeah, I agree. Let's think about terrorism today. Is the order of the day. You know this expression, terror is the order of the day. You're about to learn something about the French Revolution. So, a little backstory. 18th century France was in a massive financial crisis. Louis XVI had spent a great deal of money. People on a great palaces and all these wonderful extravagant things. The clergy was spending a lot of money doing whatever the clergy does. The poor were paying for a lot of this. They were subsidizing this. And they weren't being reflected. So in any event, there was a huge divide between the haves and the have-nots. And there was also like a lot of lavish spending going on, and people didn't have a say in how it was done. So the king, of course, could increase taxes. It was his decree, but doing so would upset the nobility, which he relied on to collect taxes and to govern provinces and stuff. And so, in an attempt to appease the kind of unrest that was emerging, an estates general was organized, which was like, let's get everybody together, all the representatives together, and let's talk this out, basically. Of course, this was sort of doomed by design. Incidentally, here's a cartoon from the time where the commoners are supporting the king and the clergy on the backs. So the Estates General was composed typically in terms of, or insofar as there was a first estate, second estate, third estate. One was the clergy, one was the nobility, and then everybody else. Any proposal passing this estate's assembly had to get 2/3 of the vote. So 2/3 of the groups would have to vote in favor. So despite representing less than 5% of the population, the first and the second estate could veto anything from the third estate. So 95% of the population could say, yes, we would like you to, I don't know, redistribute grain because our people are starving. And the nobility and the clergy could say, nah. And that happened. So the third estate got a little upset about this. They were starving. There were people dying based on this financial crisis, and there wasn't a lot of movement from the upper. The third estate decided let's forget this whole setup. We're going to form a national assembly and we're going to demand a constitution that gives us more power, more authority, so we can actually have a say in government. And they refused to leave the estate assembly. There's the estate general assembly until the king recognized this, and they kind of made a show of force in doing so. And eventually, Louis XVI capitulated, and he commanded the first and the second estate to join the National Assembly. Sounds good, right? Great appeasement. Well, things didn't change fast enough, and by July 14th, the public started revolting. This is a storming of the Bastille, where arms were carried out, where people were arming themselves essentially so they could overthrow the government, and eventually they did. Louis XVI was deposed, beheaded, in infamy or fame, right? Like it's pretty well known. During this time, so revolutionaries, they didn't have experience running a government. They didn't know how to run a government. They just were outraged, of course, and justifiably so. People were dying. So now they had to lead, and there were various factions and groups that fought together, like collectively and together. As soon as there wasn't a common enemy, they started falling apart, right? As soon as there wasn't one opposition force that united them, they started coming apart. And so some groups were warring with others internal to this new attempt at forming a government. And eventually, one major group emerged, the Jacobins, and they emerged on essentially a doctrine of terrorism. This is terror is the order of the day. During disputes and conversations, like how do we govern? How do we get people in rank and file? How do we get order back into the government? Terrorism was the plan, and it was an implemented plan. French National Convention dictate terror is the order of the day. Robespierre was one of the famous mouthpieces of the revolution. What did he mean by this? Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. And they had machinery to implement this, the guillotine. Thousands on thousands and thousands of people were executed. Why? Terror, to keep people in line. This is an illustration, a comic at the time, Robespierre placing the executioner themselves on the guillotine after executing everyone else. So I want to pause right here, slight detour. So it's sometimes claimed that we can't judge people from history, especially if they're far off or from different cultures. I disagree. You absolutely can. Here's an example. George Washington was, by my reckoning, a great man, which is a judgment. He was also a slave owner, which is a judgment. Can't have it both ways. We can judge historical figures by our own lights. That's fine. We just got to make sure that we're not putting ourselves in an epistemic situation and evaluating them by their own terms. We don't know. Are you sure you wouldn't have agreed that terror was the order of the day? I'm not. I still think it was the wrong way. But I'm also in a different environment. I also think that I might not do that. I might think of myself as better than that. I might think that I wouldn't have owned slaves. Am I sure? It's unclear. Could still judge. Some other examples. Order of the centuries. Terrorism's not new. Sons of Liberty, instrumental in activities starting the rebellion of the 13 colonies, throwing tea and whatnot. No taxation without representation. John Brown organized armed opposition to slavery in 1859 in the States. Famous uprising, famously squashed. Irish Republicans stage insurrection in Ireland. This is the Eastern Rebellion in 1916. Why? British rule. Not represented. Opposition party. Cuban dictatorship or Cuban Revolution witnessed the overthrow of Batista's corrupt dictatorship in 1959 by the rebels. All of this arguably classified as terroristic activity or involving terrorist activities. Infamous cases. These are vastly outnumbered by less well-known cases, of course. These are the ones we see on Wikipedia. These are the ones we see in the news. Globally, about 1 in 2,000 deaths, just to give you some context, were due to terrorism in 2019. These infamous or famous cases are blips in the broader scheme. It's a considerable amount of data too. Data about terrorism. Here's a place where you can find some information about data associated with terrorism. It's not the only place. There are a couple. There are two. There's this, and then the iterate database. But this one's easier to access, so I use this as my example. But it's an open source database, including information about terrorist events around the world. It contains about 200,000 or information about 200,000 different terrorist attacks, stuff like 88,000 bombings, 19,000 assassinations, like 45 variables or metadata fields that are filled in about this stuff. And almost 4 million news articles and 25,000 news sources were used to collect incident data between 98 and 2017 about this. And the span is from 1970 up till 2020. So it stops in 2020. And you see a considerable amount of data gathered about terroristic activities. And this is the definition of terrorism that the database uses. So threat or actual use of illegal force and violence by non-state actors to attain a political, economic, religious, or social goal through fear, coercion, or intimidation. Don't worry, we'll poke at that. I just want to give you some context. This is how they're characterizing terrorist activities. And the scope includes things like domestic paramilitary organizations, international paramilitary groups, kinetic and digital violence. The associated here, you see like the emblem from the French Republic, and on the far, your far right, pun intended, you see the Proud Boys emblem. Again, so there's, if you'll note here, again, from 70 to 20, decrease, kind of decreasing in a kind of a bit of a sharp uptick as we enter into the 20s. Now, here's some, if you were poking around at this, this is the sort of information you see. This is part of the database. You'll see they cover things like white supremacists, nationalists, anti-globalization, unknowns, left-wing extremists, unknowns. They try to characterize it by target types, number of fatalities, number of injuries, where I had filtered on just the US, and then they have like a unique ID for each of these events. It's a pretty useful resource. Again, some examples. I just picked three. One was an example from a racist attack. One was an example from a suicide bomber who was anti-globalist, and one from an Antifa, an anti-violence protester who unfortunately murdered someone. Okay, so I've glossed over, though, quickly what terrorism is. I give you some origins, told you about the data associated. There's some data associated with it. We'll pick out a minute. But if you're like me, you're probably wondering this whole time, well, what exactly is terrorism? Saw a little definition, seemed plausible, but what exactly is it? What counts? You're right to think that because it's a vexed term. I want to highlight why it's a vexed term by going back in history a little bit more. Reconstruction in the US. Do you know about this? Reconstruction era. So this is a post-Civil War. If you're familiar, the North won and slavery bad. Stop doing that. But it devastated the South. Like the Confederacy lost, and there was a need to like unify the nation and bring us back together. And so there was essentially martial law imposed on the South by the North, but also an investment, an economic and financial investment into the South to reconstruct within, kind of within the image of the federal government, a new South. So this was the Reconstruction era. After, I won't go into detail, but there were some political moves that went on throughout the course of this that ended up ending the Reconstruction era. A lot of folks at the time thought it was a failure, and there was a sharp shift back into the old school Southern mentality that resulted in things like Jim Crow laws being enforced in the South that enforced segregation and curtailed political power for Black people. So in 1900, 90% of the Black population in the US was in the South. After the outbreak of World War I in 1914, this led to a shift in demographics. It's called the Great Migration. Between 1910 and 1930, it saw Black population in the North increase by 40%. It was upward mobility in the geographic sense. Here's a map. You can see people were moving from the south. There was a lot of the Jim Crow and whatnot. It was moving up into the north. It was both economic and geographic uplifting, I should say. World War I ended in 1918, and troops, black and white, returned home to few jobs. This is just the truth. Black troops were respected in Europe. They were treated like human beings. But when they returned to the US, they returned back to the discrimination that they left. This created a lot of economic and racial tensions, as you might expect, but culminating, some say, in the Red Summer of 1919, which was just a rash of riots and lynchings that happened. Like, it was pretty bloody. Many of these, for what it's worth, I think would count as terroristic. At least the lynchings would count as terroristic activities. Like coercion, lynching. I'm not sure if you're familiar with lynchings, but essentially groups would come out, often white groups would come out, target a marginalized group in the States, and they would hold a public festival, essentially, of murdering, torturing individuals. Kids would get out of school early. They would put on their Sunday clothes. They would make postcards and they would send them around the States. It was a condoned and encouraged activity. Yes, we can judge people. Yes, we can. So in any event, plausibly characterized as terroristic activity. Here's what I'm getting at, though. I'm not sure if you would dispute what I've just said so far, but I wanna see if you would dispute this. So this is a cartoon from around the time. It's the New Crowd Negro Making America Safe for Himself. And you'll note this cartoon, you have an individual who's shooting at folks running away. He's clearly a military person, somebody who's military trained on the left, and he's got a flag that has what should be familiar sights from the lynchings. Also, he's saying, since the government won't stop my violence, I'll take it into my own hands. What do you think? Is this terrorism? It's self-defense. It is self-defense. Is it terrorism? Think about it for a second. This is going to be the easy one, by the way. So take a minute, talk amongst yourselves. What do you think? And I tried to make it a little easier the way I prompted it, but we'll see how far that goes. I will.
Okay. Is it okay if I just take a picture of the question?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Oh, but
In most cases, the
Yeah, I'll flip it back. There you
thank you.
but
go. So how many of you say, yes, this counts as terrorism? And how many of you say, no, this does not count as terrorism? Okay, let's keep this in mind, because as I said, that was the easy. You guys familiar with the 2017 Unite the Right rally? It's kind of surprising. Charlottesville is occupied by quite a few protesters who are championing things like Nazism or neo-Nazism, alt-right ideology, spouting hate, screaming things like Jews will not replace us with tiki torches. Incidentally, I had no idea this was going on, and I lived in North Carolina around the time, and I went to a grocery store, and I completely incidental this was buying tiki torches for a dinner that night. I'm not even joking. Like completely unrelated. I had no idea this was going on. And the people in the cash register, I'm bald. I'm buying tiki torches, and they were like, "What's going on?" And I was like, I have friends over tonight." And they got it. They were like, "Oh, this guy has no idea what's going on. He's clueless." And then later when I got home, I was like, "Oh dear God." I just bought a bunch of tiki torches. Anyway, this event, I mean, it obviously sparked a lot of counter protests at the time too. People were not happy with this. The event was quickly met with these oppositions. And it reached a fever pitch when an alt-right protester drove his car through a crowd, killed one person and injured 35. What do you think?
The driving of the car that.
The driving of the car.
driving
Sure,
of-
sure. I mean, I'm leaving it purposely vague, but what do you think? Yeah.
Yeah, I
So
would say that's
so
a
does the
terrorism.
global database. Like here's the incident. Like you can see this recorded. It was in 2017. Assailant drove his vehicle to a crowd of counter protesters at the Unite the Right rally, etc. All right, that too was easy. How about this? 2017 Berkeley protests. Also kind of a counter movement, you could say. It got dirty quick. People clad in black with masks, associated overtly with the anti-fascist movement, with shields, like homemade shields and whatnot. Were taking people's phones, randomly accusing people of being Nazis, beating people up. All happened on Berkeley's campus. What do you think? Take a minute.
They're like kind of intimidating people. It seems like an protest, maybe a riot.
This incidentally is a photo from.
Think about like the intentions behind both groups. Yeah, because like this group is like I've seen they're trying to be like they're defending someone, whereas like the other group, I feel like they created their own boogeyman.
What an interesting way of putting this. You know, I'm from the South, and I grew up with around white nationalists and racists. And I myself, I don't count myself as one of them, never have been. But that is what they would say. Exactly what you said. That they're responding to movements that have placed pressure on them that don't exist. Like they're not trying to be racist, it's everybody else. They're just responding, they're defending themselves.
From what though?
Oh, from the mass media, from the liberal media, from whatever boogeyman they see. And so it's the same mentality, right? So I'm not saying this to weigh on either side. I'm just saying what you said is almost exactly what they would say. Yeah, Matthew.
So, based on this definition of terrorism,
Mhm,
unless I am killing for pleasure,
mhm,
if I have basically any greater goal,
mhm,
probably it's terrorism. If I use illegal force / violence,
mhm.
or even if I don't use it, if I threaten it.
Assuming you're not a nation or a state.
Well, yeah, then it's a war and it's totally different, I'm sure.
Mhm,
But if it is a citizen of any sort, this definition seems to count any greater goal of influence over a population
Mhm,
that has illegal force or violence. I don't know why they separate this, but whatever.
mhm,
It seems to just encompass all of that as terrorism.
mhm.
Because again, the freeway shooter who was just taking shots because he wanted to and was taking aim, not terrorism. But if he was doing that because he was tired of the racists of the South,
Mhm.
terrorism.
Yeah, I think this definition would classify each as you described. I think I don't want to put myself in the position of the folks defending this, but I think they would say that's right. That's the accurate line to draw. Yeah.
So the distinction would be like kind of like articulated targeting really is kind of seems to be an unspoken part of this. Because I'm trying to consider it.
I mean, presumably if you do it well, right?
Right.
Because you could do it poorly.
Right. It seems like the like something like not randomly occurring, but like emergent mob violence, for example, versus like organized, like we want this to happen. Seems like that's different, even if the outcome may be similar.
Well, it depends. Like, what sort of random mob violence do you have in mind that wouldn't have some kind of social, political?
I mean,
Yeah. Just
yes.
like at
I'm talking about terrorism.
maybe Burning Man. Something goes crazy at Burning Man. A bunch of drug-induced, like a love fest goes on, and somebody gets angry and they start fights, or a mosh pit.
Right.
Like those wouldn't count potentially.
I don't know, it's just off the ball.
It doesn't necessarily necessarily have to be a crowd. I mean, the Unabomber.
Oh yeah,
Oh,
The
yeah, I was
Unabomber
just
was a
thinking this
climate change
example.
activist.
that's right. That's right.
So,
Also a domestic terrorist.
try to weigh people's intentions
Mm-hmm.
here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't support the Unabomber, but just putting that out there because of the recording. I really don't.
Did you? Oh, you said you do or you don't? I was like, oh, wait a second. Yes, man.
So, based on this definition, something that doesn't fall into it, but I know did at the time.
Mm-hmm.
But my school had tons and tons of bomb threats,
Mhm.
trash can fires, tons of shit like that.
Mhm.
I will tell you, it was to get out of class.
Mm-hmm.
Let's just assume that's the case, which is probably true, right?
Mm-hmm.
They
Mm-hmm.
were terrorist events,
Social goal.
but that is not a social goal. That is a personal goal to not go to class.
I
They
think
didn't
there's
care if everybody
I
went
think
to
there's
class.
wiggle room to say that. I think there's wiggle room to count that as not
As a
exactly not a social goal.
Oh,
And I think that's a plausible read that it's not a social goal. It's and so, but I also don't think I would want to count like a kid trying to get out of class by setting a bathroom on fire
I
or like a
can-
trash can on fire. That's probably not a terrorist.
I can say that they were
Uh-huh.
because when people were inevitably caught, maybe
Uh-huh.
duh, they're dumb high school students, they were charged with terrorism.
Ah,
Now,
this
it was
is
often dropped.
sure. This is different. This is different.
Oh,
We're
this
talking
is
about the
different?
legal code or the policy definition. We're gonna get into that in just a second.
Oh.
Activists, like anti-war activists that
Mhm.
target private weapons companies.
Yeah,
So that's like terror on terror.
is it?
Because like.
It's part of the question.
Is it
I
illegal
don't
to do
think
that?
so.
I mean, we were talking about Antifa here, like the anti-fascist sort of protest. Uh, let's get back to this because I think it directly impacts what you're saying. So, the Berkeley 2017, right? Do you think this is terrorism or involve terroristic activities? Yes? No? In between?
You know what? I actually have a question.
Yeah.
What's legal force?
What's legal force?
Yeah, because if it's. if
Oh,
it's
like
illegal-
state sponsored, like the police, like law enforcement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm. Or military force.
Or military.
Yeah, yeah. So this is not recorded in the database. In fact, the only incident from Berkeley is this one from 1985. So I don't understand. I don't understand why you wouldn't count this. I also don't understand how it doesn't fit the definition.
Threatened, yeah.
It was a threat or actually there were people injured, like people were injured. It was a legal force and violence by non-state actors to attain a political, economic, religious, or social goal through fear, coercion, or intimidation. Fear, coercion, or intimidation. Take the camera, take his phone. They're accusing people of being Nazis. Like fear, coercion, intimidation. I don't understand how this wouldn't count. Yeah.
So I guess I was thinking of it in terms of like a planned act, but I guess
Mhm.
this kind of does not require that necessarily.
No.
I mean, the
It's-
threatened person possibly, but it could arise and meet all of those other criteria.
Yeah.
I mean, this definition makes it seem like it's way too broad. Like if I threaten to rob somebody because I want, it helps my economic goals,
Mhm.
that would be terrorism.
Maybe. Is it a social goal?
Well, it
It
has
says or.
It's an
economic
economic
goals.
goal.
Or if I say God.
Is it
wanted-
economic? Is like me feeding myself? That's an economic goal? I don't think that's what economics
Well,
mean.
what if I want to steal your watch or something?
Point of clarity then.
What is that? What are you
Independent
going to steal my watch and then sell it to pursue some broader economic goal of like making people realize that you can rob me and suddenly the economy will be better?
No, I think there is a other economic goal.
I mean, I think economic itself is used here, just like political doesn't mean like your specific political beliefs, or religious doesn't mean your specific religious beliefs. This is like it's built into a broader social.
No, it's just, yeah, I think that's more of an independent goal. Like
Yeah,
desire. If I
this
want
is
to
like
steal
this
your
is the
watch-
trash can. This is
Yeah.
the burning trash can to get out of class. Like those are not exactly what's in scope. Yeah.
But to kind of press on to support the idea that this is a little too broad,
Mhm.
right? So if you're looking through my journal,
Mhm.
and I was one of the trash can burners. And it said,
He was
I was
definitely,
told-
you were definitely one of the trash can burners.
Not 'cause I was in the music room, I never did work anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Point being,
You should
so-
just, you should be like, look in the database, John. Am I in the database?
my record. Anyway, no, so if I, in my journal,
Mhm.
had written something about how school is state-sponsored prisons for children,
Uh-huh.
right?
Uh-huh.
Suddenly now, there's a plausible social goal, political goal, right?
Yeah.
If I robbed somebody because I was like, screw the 1%. And
Yeah.
it's always the landlords and the shop owners.
I get it. I'm on
So,
board.
It seems a little broad.
I think you're right. But now let me explain why.
Okay.
It's almost like you guys are plants. Oh, incidentally, I just wanted to throw this picture in here. I wonder, curious if you think this was terrorist activity, but I'm not going to go into that. So here's a reasoned characterization of the challenges associated with creating a definition for terrorism that's not too broad and not too narrow. So there is no general consensus on what terrorism is. It's just not the case. It wasn't the case in 2004. It's not the case now. The difficulty does seem to rely on the fact that it requires taking a position. It requires the judgment I was talking about earlier. It's kind of built in. The Taliban and Osama bin Laden were once called freedom fighters by the CIA and backed by the CIA when they were resisting the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Of course, now they're at the top of just about every, or at the time, and even today, they're still pretty high up there on the list of terrorist organizations. In 2004, the UN viewed Palestinians as freedom fighters, responding to unlawful occupation of land by Israel and engaged in long-established legitimate resistance, yet Israel regards them as terrorists. It requires taking a position. And so what happens when it requires taking a position, you don't want to take a position, and you need to create a definition, you get broad and vague so you can fit every position in, right? And that's kind of what goes on in discussions around terrorism. It's one of the reasons why it's hard to create a definition of it. You don't want to rule certain things out. If you tried to create a definition of terrorism that was strong enough to count things like, I don't know, the Unite the Right rally, but also excluded things like the Berkeley protests, how would you do it? Because I don't think that definition I was pointing to does, despite the fact that it's not included in the database. Now, before you answer, some sample political definitions. This one's just for fun because it was around the time when terrorism became like the order of the day. This was the government intimidation during the reign of terror in France. Kind of easy. Like the English were like, yeah, we know what terrorism is. It's what the French are doing right now. They said it was. Let's just stick with that. A few years later, League of Nations, all criminal acts directed against the state and intended or calculated to create a state of terror in the minds of particular persons or groups of persons or the general public. So create a state of terror. Iran, 1987, in an anti-terrorism like conference, the government representatives from the government of Iran. So terrorism is act carried out to achieve an inhuman and corrupt objective involving a threat to security of any kind and violation of rights acknowledged by religion and mankind. And then the U.S. premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetuated against non-combatants targets by subnational groups or clandestine organizations. You see some common themes: violence, coercion, etc. And of course, UN General Assembly, criminal acts intended to calculated to provoke a state of terror, etc., etc., etc. Also, Brazil, should throw that in there. Objective of provoking social or generalized terror. Commonalities across these. Commonalities are not enough to get to that precise, narrow definition that we're looking for, because they just essentially involve things like coercion. And I highlight this because putting aside the fact that you need to take a stand to create a definition of terrorism, coercion is notoriously difficult to define. And yet it's very important. Here's a rough and ready characterization within an ontological context of what terrorism might amount to. Terrorist act is an act of communication particular type of speech act involving violence and coercion. A speech act, just remind you, involves intention to convey meaning performed by the act. So there's that intention that we were discussing earlier built in. And example categories include things like assertions, directions, commissives, expressives, declarations. And here's a little snippet from CCO. Again, so far this should be a refresher. But it reflects characterizations of terrorist speech pretty well. This is a composition of overall classification of speech acts incorporating 15 individual speech acts identified in ISIS English language videos. I didn't make this, but you'd almost think I did, given what I just said in the previous slide. As you can see, directives, expressive, commissive declarations, they come up. They create fear in target populations, enforce authorities and responsibilities, memberships and exclusions, and impress messages and mythos, all of which involves coercion in these messages. What is coercion? Before you look at this, though, let me just say, coercion. If I walk over to you and I hold a gun to your head and say, give me $20, and you give me $20, have I coerced you into giving me $20?
Yes.
If I would not have given you the $20.
That is right. Assuming you would not have given me the $20. If I put a chip in your head that makes it so that you just do whatever I say whenever I flip a button, unbeknownst to you, and I walk over to you and say, give me $20, and I flip the switch, you don't know. You just give me $20. Is that coercion?
Only to me.
Sure, but is it coercion? I've not coerced you if I flip a switch.
We don't really intend to keep the money in there.
I do.
I would say that.
I want that money. Give me that money. Yeah.
I want to say no,
Okay.
because it's missing a crucial element of threat.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, like, if you are silver tongued,
Mm-hmm.
you convinced me to give you the $20, have you coerced me?
Mm-hmm.
Not in the way that we're talking about with terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
Coercion in that is equivocating over something where it's like, well, you coerced me in the sense that you did something and got me to do something in response, but that's a little too vague for coercion.
My battery's not there.
Oh.
I was gonna steal that. I hear what you're saying. What if I told you? Can I use your other one? What if I told you that I was gonna flip a switch? What if I told you I was gonna flip a switch before I did it? And I said, I'm gonna flip a switch and it's gonna make you give me $20.
There's still no threat.
No threat. So I suppose you'd say too that if I convinced you with philosophical argument to give me $20, I've not coerced you. Are you sure about that one? Because think about this. I probably could convince you to give me $20 even though you don't want to. I'm a trained arguer and I'm very charismatic. I could probably do it even though you don't want to. And I can say that with confidence because I absolutely have done this before. I grew up poor. I used to convince people to give me money all the time and they were not equipped to handle me because they didn't know how to argue. Was that coercion? At least it was manipulation. That absolutely manipulated those people. Mm-hmm. Before I take another question, I definitely do need to borrow somebody's charger because this thing's about to die.
He's got to coerce you to get the charger.
Yes, Jay's trying to coerce me to get a charger.
He's got 25%. He's just telling you it's a 3%.
Everybody tell him no.
I'm gonna flip that switch. I also need the.
It's straight up manipulation.
That's right.
So much.
Thank you.
I get extra credit.
Yes, absolutely.
No.
You could move into the whole propaganda side of things and say,
Oh, don't
it's
worry.
middle
That's where we're
class.
going. That's where we're going next. It's almost like you saw us for. Like that's the next sort of under that coercion, that big red bold coercion. The next one is propaganda. So, yeah.
It seems to me like an element that's important is once the coercion has taken place,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like the person that was coerced should still have a sense of, I didn't want to do that, but I did.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of being convinced in some way, whether
That wouldn't rule out me convincing you to give me $20 because I've definitely done that where where people afterwards were like, man, I didn't want to give them that money, but they did.
I mean, then I think they weren't convinced. I think they were coerced in that. Maybe
All right.
if they take on the argument and agree with you,
Mhm.
it's different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask. Is there a difference? Because we're kind of flip-flopping words here.
Mm-hmm.
Being coerced and being convinced.
Mm-hmm.
Are they the same or are they different?
I think they're
That's the
different.
distinction is at the
I think
end
they're
of it,
definitely.
if
I think they're different.
If you're not convinced, but you did it anyway, I think that's.
Yeah. And that's the sort of scenario I'm talking about. I'm talking about convincing people to give me money when I was a kid and an adult. I needed money, despite them not wanting to. Yeah.
Lend us money,
Mm-hmm.
but she would charge us interest.
Mm.
But and if we don't pay her the interest, she would threaten us. Like she would
Mm.
blackmail us with things like with our mom and stuff.
So I got to say, like the adult in me thinks that's terrible, but the charlatan in me from when I was a kid is like, why didn't I think of that? That's great. That's brilliant. It's the gift that keeps on giving. I was bigger than those people. Yeah. What do you think? Is this coercion?
I think it's coercion. Like,
Mm.
can't say no, but there will be consequences.
Mm-hmm. There will be consequences.
I feel
There will.
like bad consequences, but it's still consequences.
Yeah. Right.
You accept the deal, no.
Yeah, I always accept it.
Mm. Let me put this into a broader like socio-political context, and because there's something similar goes on. Have you heard of this One Belt One Road initiative? Okay, so the Chinese Communist Party is this initiative, One Belt One Road, where they basically lend money to countries to build infrastructure, digital or like material infrastructure, and those countries are often countries in need, and infrastructure that's built is often in service of promoting like globalism, distributing goods across borders and whatnot, and fostering like the overall vision of the CCP in a global context. And so there's concern, and I think evidence to suggest this concern is validated that this allows an in for CCP and other countries' political decision making, regulations and policies. And you could see this very clearly. Like the concern would be, this should be manifest if I give your country a great deal of money to build up works, and you need that money, and now I need a favor from you, and you're still paying me back, and you want some like maybe pleasant terms, or maybe you don't want me to charge too much interest, or maybe you don't want me to go tell mom, or whatever the equivalent here would be. Is that coercion? Has an environment been set up where coercion is occurring? This is an interesting question. And I want to point to a kind of standard characterization in philosophical circles of what coercion amounts to. And I want you to keep those sorts of examples in mind as you evaluate whether this is a good characterization of coercion. So S coerces someone else just in case. The first aims to prevent someone from doing something. The second person is at least implicitly aware of that. The second person is at least implicitly aware that if they do this thing, then that first person will bring about some negative consequence that they don't want. That second person doesn't perform the thing. And the reason they don't perform the thing is because they don't want that bad thing to happen. So recall, when we're evaluating definitions, this is a definition. We have that TE with the thing defined in the definitional expression. And when we're evaluating these, it involves at least two steps. You start with the thing being defined, and you assume it's true, and you try to find a scenario in which the conditions fail. Alternatively, you find scenario where the conditions hold, and then you say, in this case, you would look back and say, is that coercion? So it works both ways. So again, to say that one more time, you would assume coercion happens, and then you try to find counterexamples to at least one of these conditions. Alternatively, you assume these conditions hold, and you try to find a scenario in which whatever you described is not coercion. So either or would be a counterexample to this definition. It is your job now to hunt a counterexample. Or try and fail, and this will be our definition of coercion. It's not going to be, but go forth. And I will now walk around and try not to coerce you.
So. Doesn't at all.
Oh, I love paradox.
There you have a paradox.
Well, this question is a paradox.
Let's-
Yeah, that doesn't really sound like coercion.
So I had a friendly conversation with my best friend ChatGPT about this.
Uh-huh.
And, so in finding the counterexamples, it said, well, you can have random, non-targeted acts of violence and symbolic acts without a clear demand. And so it made me think of the new Joker movie, right? So if anybody saw the Joker with Joaquin Phoenix, he really had no motive. He was just insane, right? And all motives were like believed upon him. And so the second movie, part 2, it really tries to strip that away and show actually he isn't this mastermind. He's just insane, right? So then it makes me think about like Dadaism, surrealism, and fantasy and media and art from like the early 20th century, right? Where like all of a sudden you had these German artists and they would put like a dirty urinal inside of like an art gallery. It was like meta art, or it was like anti-art. But in this sense, it was like it's the idea that like we can quantify what an entity is, but we can't quantify what nothing is because it's the opposite of entity. And so therefore we have to say, well, it's a spatio region like the trunk of a car. We can't say it's nothing. We have to say what it is. We can't say it's nothing because we can't really categorize nothing. So in this sense, the problem is that what you have here is like, in order to be a counterexample, there needs to be no motive, but that in itself can be the motive, right? Look at like the killer at University of Virginia Tech. That was probably when you guys were all very, very young. But like, he literally had no motive. He was like insane, but his motive was just like to cause like crazy.
Watch the world burn.
So that in itself is motive. So to not have an intent for influence or not have any symbolism or anything is really hard to prove here. And so I just don't know if there's actually a counterexample to coercion, if you're using coercion as an example of terrorism and active coercion. I don't think that there's a counterexample to it.
So Jay is suggesting that there's no counterexample to this. He's given a discussion about like or he's argued, because the motives are involved, they're kind of embedded. It's hard to like establish when they aren't or are in a place. And he's thinking this is airtight.
Well, there's always motive. That's the thing. Even if you don't understand what the motive is, there's motive, right?
Yeah.
And so
This is true.
Human beings don't do anything without motive. Like,
I think that's right.
We don't close a window because of motive. We everything we do is because of a motive.
Let me ask you guys this. So I teach you things because I want you to not be ignorant. I want to keep you, I want your lives to be better. I want you to be informed, and I want you to have a life of a mind and all that good stuff. I'm trying to impart skills on you. I aim to prevent you from being ignorant. You know that. And you know that if you don't listen to me, I might fail you. And you don't want that. It seems undesirable. And so you listen, in part at least. And part of the reason why you listen is because I might fail you. Now, of course, I'm talking John in the hypothetical sense, but am I coercing you into learning? I would hope not. Maybe manipulating you into learning. I'm on the hook for that. But coercing you into learning, am I coercing you into learning? I would hope I'm not coercing you into learning. Did I not satisfy the conditions there? Or did I?
But there is kind of an agreement when we enroll for the class. We know how class works. So it's like the casino example, because Matthew was saying, did the casino really force you to stay because there are no windows and clocks? But we agreed on that by entering into the casino.
You're right. So maybe it's not me. Maybe the university is coercing you because you've agreed to this commitment, right? And the university wants you to not be ignorant. And you know that.
John, I'm gonna amend what I said, which is airtight.
All right.
Not coercion in general, but
Mhm.
terrorism acts are acts of coercion. I think that there is no counterexample to that.
Okay.
In that situation, that's what I was focusing on. I wasn't focusing on.
I thought
the
you might have
full-
been. This is helpful clarification. So
Yeah.
so the claim here at the bottom, which we've not exactly gotten to, but it is right here in bold. So terrorist acts, they don't exhaust coercion, but they're a type of coercion. They involve, or like at least in this case, they're subclass of an act of coercion. And so they involve a lot of these features. It's a matter of necessity. But there are other acts of coercion that are not terroristic. So that would be the idea. But even before we get there, what did I just give you a counterexample? Did Elena just give you a counterexample to coercion? Do you have another? What's yours?
It seems an important distinction with like the classroom example. We're all willfully here. We know what we're
Some of you
are. We were the agents in getting ourselves in this room.
Some of you have parents that are like, you better go to school.
Yeah, there's the clue.
Maybe they're coercion.
But the one I was specifically thinking of, like withholding benevolent interference, would be in a circumstance where, like I do something with maybe consequences I did not intend, or did not agree to in some way. You know, like get in a car accident and I'm stuck in a car and somebody comes by and says, well, I could pull you out of there, but they're not responsible for bringing about the consequence necessarily.
Sure.
That's where I was stuck on. It was maybe just the wording, like bringing about through action or inaction would fix all of that.
You might be focusing on the wrong thing. So in the scenario, like you're in a car accident, you're like hanging off a bridge and somebody walks over to you and you're like, I choose violence today. And they're like, no, they're like, I could save you, but I need the keys to your car. So that's the thing. Then are you being coerced about that? Maybe. Yeah. Now you could tell other stories where they like cause the accident. It makes it even stronger, but I think we don't even need that. They're just standing over to you and weighing. Now you could have the Joker who's just like, I could or couldn't. What do you say? And but it's kind of moot at that point because it's not exactly an act of coercion because insofar as, well, no, hold on, let me take that back. Yeah, what matters is not so much the motives because you have no idea what the random roll of the die is going to show. But what does matter in this case is what you think is going on in the Joker's mind, right? You might be implicitly aware that if you, I don't know, give the keys to the car, then you're under the impression that the Joker will save you. Now, whether you're right or wrong about that is a separate question, but
that type of randomness that you find in like stock market, and let's say you're like, I don't know, there's an aim to prevent a certain action from happening. But, like consequences are just random in a way. Like you can't accurately track them.
Yeah. It's the same situation though, right? Your belief, there are many people who invest in the market and think they're gonna game it. Yeah. Your beliefs about it and the decisions you make based on those beliefs is separate from what actually happens, right?
The market's actually a really good example for a lot of things dealing with ethics, right? Because we always say that economics are amoral. They're without morals. So they fall outside of those. It's the human agent that applies ethics to it, right? So like, for example, if you have a policy and you're just gonna institute it and you say I own 30,000 condominium units and my policy is just, hey, when somebody is 31 days late of rent, then they're evicted. And I can say, well, that's an immoral policy. It applies to 30,000. But say I just have one bedroom upstairs in my attic that I rent out, and I know the person who lives there and they eat dinner with us sometimes and and then I'm going to do the same thing to him. You might look at that and being like, well, morally, I'm kind of like obligated to give the guy a second chance because I have a relationship with it. It's different. So
Mhm.
I think that you can look at it in finances and the economy differently depending upon, if it's one of these things where it's PepsiCo makes a decision across the board to lay off 30,000 employees, or you're going to make your decision to lay off one employee, those can be looked upon very, very differently.
That's true.
And
And
they're still giving the same result or the same output.
yeah. So there's like a moral or normative valence that runs alongside
Yeah.
trying to, when thinking about counterexamples, exclude those sorts of, not exactly exclude, but like operate in a more sterile environment. Economics is a more sterile environment, presumably,
Yeah.
assuming that you're not thinking about the normative. But honestly, all of the examples that we've given could have that normative layer embedded in them. We just have to tell the story slightly differently. I'm not sure if it would or should change the facts on the ground as to whether there's a counterexample or not.
And that's the hard part too, because you give it when you apply more context to a situation, moral ambiguity rises, right?
That is true. This is a pretty well-known statistic. The more specifics you add in a scenario, the more moral valence that people tend to attribute. You can describe, for example, a scenario in which somebody like that you can assert that the world is causally determined, and that yet you describe a situation very broadly in abstract terms where somebody walks over to their house one day and burns it down and kills their children. But then you assert it's all causally determined, and you can ask respondents, like people who are taking a survey on this, whether they think the person is morally responsible for that what they did, and they will say 90% will say no. Then if you spell out the same story, say it's causally determined, but spell out the same story where the kids are crying and the person's lighting the match and like throwing it in, just add more details. 90% of people will say was morally responsible for the act, despite the fact that it is still a causally determined universe. So specificity of the case does have moral impact. Yeah, pretty well tested. Let
Oh,
me.
I have a great example of that. So in the early 90s, I was having an argument with my stepfather about gang violence, right?
Mhm.
And I was like, well, he was like, they should just put them all in prison, everything. They're all terrible. And then we watched Boys in the Hood. And if anyone's ever watched Boys in the Hood, Cuba Gooding Jr.'s best friend gets killed, and then his brother goes and kills the guy who killed his brother. And my stepfather felt like the guy was totally vindicated to kill the guy at the end. And that's the whole point. It's like when you remove something and detach it, and you just have policy attached to it. And then when you apply significant context that's from an emotional stake, things change, and it's an interesting,
That is the thought. The more specificity seems to like be correlated with more empathy and emotional investment. So, as I had mentioned to Mike, propaganda is also rather important. You might be wondering, John, why are you throwing out these very challenging things to define? The point, remember, we're trying to get a handle on terrorism and terroristic activities. Already it's hard to define because you have to take a stance, right? You have to say somebody's bad guy, somebody's good guy. But even if we put that aside, it involves coercion, which is hard to define or characterize in a clear way. It also involves propaganda, which is hard to clarify and define in a precise way. I'm thinking roughly active communication designed to influence or persuade an audience in the interest of furthering an agenda. Examples being things like media manipulation or psychological impact, psyops campaigns, rhetoric and fallacies, etc. Let me put a sharpened point on this, though, just to highlight like maybe a way in of thinking of it. So in the Harlem Renaissance, there's a flourishing of artistic expression in the Black communities. Prior to that, though, there was like a lot of art that was emerging in the Black communities in the US was very reactive. Elaine Locke claimed that artistic expression in this period was a way to break internalized prejudice and better understand the cultural value that Black Americans could contribute. And he thought the way to do this was to show both high brow and low brow art, not just the high, but like illustrate the whole lived experience of the Black community from the top to the bottom. Incidentally, in practice, this is not what he funded. He just said that, but he absolutely did not really like fund this. Anyway, so Du Bois was a supporter of the Harlem Renaissance. insisted that traditional mediums write respectable texts only to promote racial pride. And he worried that unflattering depictions of Black art would only entrench existing stereotypes. And he claimed all art is propaganda. Part of the worry was that Black artists were being subsidized by white patrons. That was the readership. And so most readers were white, as were the largest publishers, and this created pressures for Black authors to write for white audiences. That was part of the worry. But more substantially, he suggested that since artists are enmeshed in networks of meaning making and justice, any self-understanding an artist has depends on navigating those networks, implying that artistic content is always in response to the public domain of ethical and political values. Hence, all art is propaganda, and we should examine or enforce it. So we're trying to get a handle on propaganda. Here's a nice way to tease out two extreme positions, or at least one a foil, if you will. Du Bois as a foil is claiming that all art is propaganda. Think about this for a minute. Do you agree? Is all art propaganda? Talk amongst yourselves.
Go back to the
I think it was a hairless chicken.
Definition, yeah.
That's like.
This is my rough characterization. No, I wouldn't say it's a definition yet.
All art, that's what they were, like, they thought they
No,
were.
I don't think art's a propaganda.
All right.
I think you have to qualify it.
How so?
I mean.
Okay, so the reason why art isn't propaganda is because when you look at how propaganda has been used, usually it's something that can be that can't be just instituted by an individual, but it's a nation or a larger group enforces it upon a public, right? So propaganda is a tool of power, right? So if you look at it this way, art really is a soft influence.
I go to France.
Because a rogue artist doesn't have the power to actually create propaganda. Now, what you can look at in the 1930s, in the late 1930s, after the Nazi takeover of Germany, when they imprisoned all of the Dadaists and the Surrealists and everything, and they said, you can only make German progressively patriotic art of the fascist state of Germany. You can say that art is propaganda. But the idea that all art, that Nipsey is creating propaganda is kind of crazy because, you know, rogue artists don't have that level of influence.
That's right. So let's huddle up before we're done. So I'd asked you, what do you think?
If we can't study other cultures.
Is all art propaganda? Yes or no?
No.
You say yes, hands. How many say no, hands?
No.
Got a lot of no's. Now there's some similarities, right? And like working through the differences. So we're like thinking through this, hopefully was illuminating. There are clear examples of artist propaganda. Art that we even look up to today. Jacques-Louis David was Napoleon's artist, right? Like there's so much glorification, beautiful, brilliant paintings from David. Napoleon on the horse, like Napoleon on the horse, like going over the Alps. I mean, it's brilliant, it's beautiful. It was also propaganda. It was used as propaganda. It was created as propaganda. Augustus had poems written, right? Propaganda, beautiful poems that we read today. If you study Latin, you get to work through, like, nevertheless, propaganda. It doesn't mean that all art is propaganda, but if you're thinking about this, no. But if you're thinking about this through the Bois's lens as a like this, I think a way to understand what he's saying is, given the time, given the culture, the oppression that the Black community still faced, it seems hard to imagine that anything produced during the Harlem Renaissance wouldn't be used as propaganda. I think if you contextualize it to that, I think there's something for him to say. Now, when Elaine Locke's claims are kind of forward-looking and promising, Du Bois lived through a lot. I mean, they both did, but Du Bois is very much involved in like that reaction and had been for decades. And so I think it's keeping that in mind, I think can help adjudicate their dispute. So to summarize here, it's notoriously challenging to characterize terrorism. Part of the reason is because you have to pick a side. You also incidentally came across this when you were thinking about propaganda. I saw the same sort of issue coming up. You're thinking about, well, propaganda for this group's not propaganda for that group. Well, terrorism for this group's not terrorism for that group. But picking a side seems important, and tension seems important. That's hard to track and hard to take a stand on. Also, coercion itself is challenging to characterize. Yet both of these seem crucial aspects when we're to keep in mind, or at least characterize when we're thinking about terrorism. It makes it a very challenging thing to define. Certainly very challenging to define in an ontological context. So when we're looking at databases that count some things as terrorists, count other things as not, or don't count other things at all, just keep in mind, it's hard. But we'll get there. Anyway, with that, we're done.